This episode of Echale Podcast is brought to you by Thrifty, proudly serving your family and community since 1940. All Thrifty ice cream is made with real California milk, and many of the ice cream recipes have remained the same for 50 years. It has definitely been a staple of my childhood, just like I know it has been for you. Visit thriftyicecream.com for an exclusive sneak peek at the merchandise you'll find at our Thrifty Ice Cream Summer Social event in Los Angeles this summer. Bienvenidos a otro capítulo de Echale Podcast. Mi nombre es José Quintero y el día de hoy pues vamos a hacer las cosas un poquito diferente. Por lo regular, a veces los capítulos son completamente en inglés o a veces completamente en español. El día de hoy, para toda la gente que nos está escuchando o nos está viendo a través de YouTube, lo quiero hacer un poquito de Spanglish porque el tema sí es bastante bueno y es algo que me interesaba tener aquí en el podcast, tener la perspectiva de alguien que vivió cositas similares a lo que ahorita el resto del mundo está viviendo, y por eso me lancé a un lugar clandestino y el día de hoy tengo como invitado a uno de mis ex jefes, Has Montana. Todavía
bueno, sí, hasta que me he cambiado el nombre. Ahora te explico.
Okay.
Hace muchos años yo entré en la radio
Ajá.
como locutor y luego programador.
¿En inglés o en español?
En inglés y luego en español.
Okay.
Y aprendí el español y todavía es muy evidente que tengo acento y a veces se me pierde palabras y expresiones y todo esto. Me dijeron que hay que escoger un nombre para el aire, y que es muy común en la radio, que muchos locutores no tienen su nombre real al aire.
Okay.
Entonces, yo estuve trabajando en Iowa, en el estado de Iowa, y me hicieron transfer a otro mercado. Y les supliqué, les dije, por favor, déjame utilizar mi nombre Has, que es cortito por Hasem. Hasem es mi nombre real. Y dijeron que, vale, cambia el nombre para Has, pero por favor, otro apellido. Y yo tengo un apellido obviamente étnico, árabe y distinto. Y no para el negocio de radio. Quieren que la gente entre con un nombre diferente, sobre todo en los años cuando entré la radio, cuando entré la industria de radio. Entonces, estuve en un hotel con un compañero de trabajo, con un periódico, y de repente me dice, para sugerir un nombre, un apellido para el aire, dice, Has Namath. Porque tenía la sección de deportes del periódico y encontró el nombre de Joe Namath, que es un quarterback famoso de los años 70.
Mira.
Y horrible para un nombre al aire también. Y dije, no, pero ¿cómo se llama este tipo de los Giants? Ni soy fan de los Giants, pero en el sentido de hacer brainstorming, dije Montana. Esto suena. Ok. Bueno, ya décadas después, traté de ajustar mi nombre para el negocio, para el sentido de negocio, porque ya me saqué del aire. Estaba haciendo programación a nivel corporativo y traté de convertirme el nombre a mi nombre real y no pegó. No pegaba para nada, porque es como cuando te conocen.
¿Cuál es tu apellido?
Bueno, mi middle name, ¿cómo se dice?
Sí.
Es Jamal.
Jamal, ok.
Sí. Y así estoy utilizando mi nombre ahora para esta nueva etapa de mi carrera, de mi vida, como Hasem Jamal.
Hasem Jamal.
Sí.
Me encanta. Me acuerdo cuando yo te conocí, yo juraba que eras latino. Porque, o sea, hablas el español muy bien, sin embargo, también somos de la misma tez de piel. Sí. Entonces dije, es latino porque sabe hablar el español muy bien. Sin embargo, sí se le nota un poquito de acento, pero muchos que vivimos aquí en los Estados Unidos tenemos acento. Entonces dije, a lo mejor es de no sé qué parte de Latinoamérica, y después me voy enterando, no. he's Middle Eastern, es árabe. Y yo, ¿qué? Se me hizo, pues latino. No, su nombre es Hassam. Y obviamente en los correos que mandaba en la empresa, cuando mandabas, porque era, Has era el jefe de mi jefa del jefe. O sea, literalmente allá arriba estaba. Y entonces Has Montana era tu correo. Y yo decía, mira, yo juraba que eras latino. ¿Por qué se te ocurre aprender el español?
Yo quise por muchos años aprender otro idioma. Yo tengo una historia distinta y diferente, y hay unos lamentos, aunque no creo en lamentar cosas porque no te sirve en la vida. Cuando yo crecía, los maestros de mis escuelas decían a mis papás, es que tu hijo el otro día se confundió en una palabra. Y tenemos la preocupación que se va a crecer confundido o con acento o tonto. Así lo decían. No son mis palabras. Y este concepto, no sé si lo diría como es una forma de xenofobia, pero sí contribuye en esta actitud, esta manera de disminuir la cultura de alguien, porque ya sabemos por muchos estudios y por ejemplos cada día en las calles de Los Ángeles y en todo el mundo, que aprender más que un idioma es buena cosa.
Sí.
Es como aprender música, es como aprender... los estudios dicen que lo más que se expone un niño, un bebé, un toddler a otros idiomas, lo más que pueden aprender, sin límites. Y lo malo de todo esto es que yo creo que yo tuve una aptitud de aprender idiomas, tengo la oreja de poder absorber idiomas. Pero a mis papás, como inmigrantes, escucharon esto de parte de mis maestros y quisieran que nosotros crezcamos con advantages, not with disadvantages.
Yeah, of course.
So they stopped speaking Arabic to us in a way that would have us bilingual Arabic.
So do you know Arab?
I know enough.
Okay.
To get into trouble.
Oh,
yeah.
La única palabra, because I really wanted to learn Arabic when I was in college, pero pues las clases ahora sí que están difíciles. Sí tuve amigos y me enseñaban un poquito de marhaba, marhabatain, y yo, ok, eso sí me lo sé. Y hasta ahí llega mi conocimiento árabe. Pero
sí hablas árabe, porque hay muchas palabras en el español que vienen de origen árabe.
Exacto.
Por la influencia de los moros en España.
Yo no sabía eso.
Sí.
Entonces, muchos de nosotros pensamos que tenemos cosas distintas a los árabes, pero son muy similares. Por ejemplo, algo que a lo mejor les va a doler a muchos mexicanos, que viene siendo los tacos.
Sí.
A ver, ¿sí sabes de qué estoy hablando?
Sí.
A ver, platícame.
Sí, bueno, de hecho no sabía de esta historia totalmente hasta que estuve en un restaurante yo creo que fue para el 5 de mayo, que yo siempre tenía la impresión que es que muchos americanos piensan que el 5 de mayo es el día de independencia para México. Y yo dije, no, es un día festivo para los gringos que aman tomar cerveza. No tiene nada que ver con, no es algo mayor, no es algo principal para México. Pero aprendí un poco más, fui a un restaurante y vi en el menú especial para el día de 5 de mayo el taco árabe. Y subí una foto en mi Instagram como esto no tiene sentido, que es un taco árabe porque tiene puerco. Y los musulmanes, igual que los judíos, no comen puerco. Y un amigo me corrigió, me dijo que fue de origen de Puebla, donde inmigraron muchos libaneses y fue en honor de los mexicanos ganando los franceses por la batalla de Puebla. Algo así. Don't quote me. Y obviamente en el Medio Oriente hay una comida que se llama shawarma, que parece igualito el trompo de carne o del
Al pastor.
el pastor. Entonces, la origen del taco del pastor es de los cristianos que emigraron del Líbano a Puebla y trajeron su trompo de puerco y no sé dónde vino el origen de la piña. Porque no es una fruta tropical, no tiene nada que ver con Líbano, esta región del mundo, creo. Pero sí, esta manera de consumir el producto como la carne desde la trompa
sí.
se llama shawarma.
¿Qué es lo que constituye la shawarma?
Shawarma.
Shawarma.
Sí.
Ah, bueno, no sé si lo dije bien, pero shawarma.
Muy bien.
Okay.
Excelente.
Pero like in Middle Eastern, what do they? It's not no es puerco. Entonces, ¿qué es? ¿O
res.
Sí es?
Normalmente res o pollo. Si vas a un restaurante aquí y pides shawarma, son res y pollo.
¿Qué otras cositas son muy similares entre los mexicanos y los árabes?
¿En cuestión de comida?
Comida, cultura o palabras.
Bueno, yo siempre he dicho que todos somos primos, porque nos parecemos muchas veces. Y, o sea, no culture is monolithic.
Okay.
Right? Pero digo que yo creo que por la mezcla entre los españoles, los moros, los árabes y todo esto, tenemos como muchos features en común. En cuestión de palabras, hay muchas influencias. La palabra ojalá viene directamente del árabe y viene de la expresión inshallah. Y ambas palabras me tocan el corazón. Sí. Y literalmente, inshallah o ojalá significa si Dios quiere. Allah es Dios. This is one of my beefs with media. Porque siempre cuando están describiendo, comentando una historia que está pasando en el mundo árabe, ponen entre comillas todo en inglés, una traducción. Yo pedí tal y tal cosa y Allah dijo bla, 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 o lo que sea.
Sí.
En otras palabras, Allah es la palabra en árabe para Dios. El Dios de los musulmanes es el mismo Dios de los judíos y los cristianos. Son los tres religiones abrámicos.
Sí. Ok, perfecto.
Y es un gran esfuerzo, creo, dividir la gente basado en la religión,
sí.
Si crees en la religión o no, pero para pintar el otro como el otro. Como el malo.
Sí, crear una división entre las culturas. And I'd like to, pivot with that, porque tú estabas diciendo de la religión. Me encantaría, antes de meternos a todo esto, ¿cómo creciste tú in, having this Arabic American culture? How was your upbringings? Did you already start feeling a division? Because you grew up in Chicago.
Yeah, I grew up in Chicago. I had a wonderful childhood. I mean, lots of challenges. But el pueblo de Chicago es una maravilla. Es una de las ciudades más bellas y preciosas que conozco yo. Yo crecí, como te mencioné, en the public school system. Crecí en un sistema público de escuelas que fue ¿cómo lo escribo? Una mezcla, como un experimento, una mezcla de razas, de backgrounds.
Afroamericano, hispano,
Sí,
árabe.
todo. Y un lado de esta moneda es buenísima para una experiencia de un niño de ser exposed a muchas culturas, porque te previene mucho prejuicio, creo, en la vida, porque exposición te previene mucho.
Sí, por eso siempre les estoy sugiriendo viajen al mundo, conozcan otras culturas, porque al conocer otras culturas sí te abre los ojos y te quita un poquito de esa ventaja de ignorante, porque creo que nacemos ignorantes a la vida y a sus alrededores y sus culturas, y cuando vamos viajando es como que, wow, yo no sabía que esto existía.
Sí. And one of the things I believe is like we're products of our environment in life. And so I'm blessed and lucky that my environment was multicultural por naturaleza.
Sí.
Like it was just that way. El otro lado de la moneda fue de que no teníamos comunidad árabe realmente. Teníamos algunos amigos, pero vivían en otros lados. We didn't see them very often. Pero sí son relaciones de la vida,
Sí.
cuando son de calidad.
Una comunidad más árabe sería como Michigan.
Sí. Y ahora más en Chicago, de hecho. Cuando yo crecía en Chicago no hubo tanto, o a lo mejor fue lejos de nosotros. El chiste fue de que yo fui a Michigan State for my university years, que tenía un poco también, pero el mero centro, el epicentro de la población árabe en Michigan se encuentra en Detroit y Dearborn. Dearborn es una maravilla. Hoy no pasé ni el tiempo suficiente para absorber las cosas buenas de Dearborn. De hecho, estoy escribiendo un blog de Dearborn ahorita que se va a sacar pronto.
Sí.
Porque tiene mucha cultura y es una mezcla, pero la población árabe en Dearborn es también muy diversa. No es de un solo país, es de muchos países. Y una de las cosas que siempre he creído es que en la humanidad tenemos más en común que distintos.
Sí. ¿Cuándo hubo una distinción? ¿Cuándo te diste cuenta que, okay, I mean, you probably grew up knowing you were Arabic, but when did you feel like, oh my gosh, being Arabic or Middle Eastern is not cool? ¿Eso pasó antes de el 2001, los ataques?
Sí, mucho más.
Okay, entonces ya...
I think our country has a long history of looking for somebody to blame. I remember a change, como si fuera un switch. Because, we lived in this apartment until I was about 8, I want to say.
Wow.
8 or 9, maybe a little older. I can't remember.
Yeah.
And then we moved, same town, different neighborhood, so I changed schools because the district changed.
Okay.
And right around the same time, and I'm going to have to say the year, so you're going to start guessing my age, and so I'm just going to, say, in 1973,
okay,
there was an Arab oil embargo, meaning the nations of OPEC, which included nations outside of the Arab world, as a way to protest American foreign policy with Palestine and other things, I'm sure. So don't quote me on the history part of this. I've not been a great
I'm asking
student.
for your experiences.
Yeah. So overnight, the American population, my experience was that the Arabs were the bad guys overnight.
Wow.
Because there was an entitlement to the energy, the gas prices that went up from, at the time, like 30 cents to 53 cents a gallon. Can you imagine that?
Yeah.
First of
Back
all,
in the...
it makes me look like I'm 90 years old, but I'm not.
No. My parents' age.
And I remembered seeing in the newspaper, like the political cartoons were like they drew caricatures of Arabs as being these greedy, evil, blood-drinking, huge nose, like evil people because they had created an economic policy to raise the price of oil per gallon. Out of the blue, like one day I'm in school and it's like you're with the same kids that you grew up with, and the next day they're making Arab jokes, cruel comments. And part of that is kids are idiots.
Yeah.
A lot of times they're mean, you know,
They're
also,
repeating what they hear at home.
they're reflections of their upbringing, right? Products of their environment. And so I'm like, I know this person. Where did this come from? So I remembered it then. I learned how to grow a thick skin.
You were 8 years old?
I was around that age.
I mean, you were really young.
I was like, between 8 and 10 years old.
But
So I mean, then as the years went on, I just remembered like I'd never been in a majority population. Like I never lived or was around a very profoundly Arab community based on numbers, based on the data, based on the surroundings, based on the numbers. And so I was working throughout the Midwest through my college and radio career and ended up in Miami. And ironically, it's where I fully committed to learning Spanish.
Yeah.
But it was also like, well, you know, you've been to Miami. When you go to Miami, people, at least then, will talk to you Spanish first.
Yes.
It's like you have to disprove that you don't speak Spanish first before they switch to English. And it's a perfectly bilingual town. And it's like so fluid that way and elevated in terms of their understanding them as bring on the languages, we're good. So when I first moved there, of course, I knew the alphabet and un café, por favor. That was it. And so when I'd be welcomed into conversations at work or in public, I'd immediately say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't speak Spanish." And they're like, "Oh, we thought you were Cuban. Where are you from?" And I'd say, "Oh, I'm Iraqi of origin and born here." And they're like, "Oh, cool." And they just all switched to English, and that was that. And then, I mean, that gave me this immersion into
the Latin culture
to begin with. And I was in Miami for about 2.5 years before I moved to California, to Los Angeles. And so I went from Cuban-centric and South American-centric to Mexican and Central American-centric exposure. But to me, it was just like, oh, wow, like the importance of family, the social connections, the warmth, the social warmth of the culture, all of these things to me resonated. And they were things that I hadn't necessarily gotten a lot of prior to that.
When you were growing up and people were saying mean things in the media, in the newspaper, at school, did you ever go back, or did your family ever go back to Iraq and you're just like, wow, it's not what they're saying in the media? Like, what is Middle East to you?
Yeah. You know, it's funny because even moving my content focus to how Arabs are featured in media now, I'm learning so much more about terminology and experiences that I didn't know before. And there were things that I just never thought about. So the term Middle East is, to many people, an Orientalism term because it's the Middle East relevant to Europe. Yeah. And so it almost kind of like takes the zing out of the, you know, the aura of Arab countries or Asia by calling it the Middle East. So it literally are, words are inventions. We make up words and terms to suit our needs. And so there's a philosophy out there that is ringing with a lot of people that, call it East Asia or call it the Arab world or call it X, Y, and Z, but Middle East is like a colonial term. But that
so when
said,
you went back to, would it be Iraq? Or
yes.
Okay.
I've been back to Iraq a few times. So the most one of the most important trips for me was when I was 12, and my parents sent me by myself. I went as an unaccompanied minor, and it was late 70s or maybe 1980, and it was one of those scenes where you go to the airport and there are like 734 family members waiting for you. Maybe not that many. I'm exaggerating,
That's beautiful,
but it was gorgeous. I was overwhelmed because I've been flying for like what felt like 2.5 days, and we were with connections and all sorts of stuff. I was exhausted. I didn't sleep on the flights, but there was this overwhelming number of people. And my Arabic got better that summer, and I stayed with one family or another. Just all of my cousins and I just spent tons of time together. We would like swim in the Tigris River. It was just an amazing summer.
This episode of Echale Podcast is brought to you by Thrifty, proudly serving your family and community since 1940. And guess what? When you taste Thrifty, you're tasting a legendary legacy that has brought people together with award-winning ice cream for over 80 years. Visit thriftyicecream.com for an exclusive sneak peek at the merchandise you'll find at our Thrifty Ice Cream Summer Social event in Los Angeles this summer. And guess what? I have some exciting news. Join me live and in person on Sunday, July 21st from 1 to 3 p.m. to celebrate National Ice Cream Day with complimentary scoops of Thrifty ice cream and a special live taping of this podcast at Thrifty Summer Social located at the Bespoke LA Cultural Hub on Fairfax Avenue. I'm going to put the information right here, and I cannot wait to meet you and share some thrifty fashions and enjoy a day filled of fun, delicious ice cream together. All right, so I'll see you there.
Is very similar to my experience growing up, and I would go, I think I was like 13 the first time that I went on my own to Mexico for a whole summer, and then I did it from 13 to 20 where I would literally spend my summers in Mexico just because just being around family, just being around that warmth, spending time with your cousins was so, like, you can't put a price to it. So just hearing that experience, I can totally resonate with that.
Did you feel that? Did you feel a push to go there, or did you want to, or did you have any parts of it that you didn't want to do, but once you got there, you were like, "Oh, I'm so glad I did this"?
Well, I mean, we grew up going because my parents, my mom tells me now, she's like, your dad was never able to take you on Disney trips or any like vacations because he would save up whatever he could for a whole year because we would go in December. And it wasn't just paying a flight for himself. It was like paying a flight for my mom, for himself, and then my brother. So I remember we would always go to the travel agency like in September. And like, that's when I knew like, oh my God, we're going to get our tickets to Mexico because it was the opportunity to be in a place where I felt a little bit more free, because in California, and I lived in the Inland Empire, it was like you just stayed home and did all, like, that's all you did. And my mom was very strict. She wouldn't really let us go out, and we were younger. So being in Mexico, my mom would be like, oh, you can go down the street or you can go to your cousin's house, which is a block away, because everybody in a small town knows each other. So then when I was of age and I said, I want to go on my own, they were a little fearful leaving their 13-year-old or go on their own. So my dad would go with me, and then he would stay a week. But then it was like me finding myself for the next 2 months. But I had family, uncles, grandparents that could and did look out for me. But at the same time, it was like, this is my growing up journey and story. That's how I became more independent and got to know me better.
I love that. And it makes me wonder if, and I don't know if you think this way, that everybody should have something like that in their life. And maybe, many people can't because they're like 7 generations back from like Norway or something like that. And they don't have anybody that they could say, I'm going to go back and visit this or that. But I think it's a need inside of a lot of people. And it, you see a lot of documentaries, but also movies and social media of people reflecting on those similar types of memories where when they go back, there's a connection that they can't really describe other than they're so glad. I need to do this.
And I think it's more important, especially like those who are first generation. Yeah. I think it is harder once you start going second, third, fourth generation, try to keep that family ties because most people probably migrate or move to other states. But in my case and my cousin's case, like being first generation students in America and learning the language, the culture, and then coming back and feeling proud of it. I'm not saying that's the experience for everybody, but for most of my cousins, it's this need and longing to prove to everybody like how Mexican we are because we love our culture. And so when we hear news that are portraying Mexico and like bad and whatnot, it's like, yes, but there's bad people everywhere. Unfortunately, there is corruption in Mexico, but I've always said there's corruption in Mexico, but they put it in your face. So you're like, all right. Versus here in the United States, I'm like, I know there's corruption, but they're not telling you.
Right.
And that's probably scarier to me.
Yeah.
And when I talk to my cousins, I'm like, oh my God, this and this and this happened in Mexico. Like, aren't you scared? And they literally rebuttal and say, well, they're killing kids in America. So we don't want our kids to go to school over there.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, well, I can't argue with that.
Yeah. I think part of when I hear you say that also reminds me of so many different ways and times that immigrants, be they Mexican, Arab, or from any other part in the world, get demonized so quickly.
Yeah.
And when the narrative is controlled by people who count on, fear or ignorance driving how people take in that information, then it just snowballs.
Yeah. And
it's really unfortunate. I mean, you and I both remember some of the kind of like big moments where people were outraged. And I'll just bring up the Trump thing when he, announced he was running the first time and said, that famous line about Mexicans are rapists. And now, it feels so 20 years ago almost because he's a different show.
Yeah.
Like than
convicted felon,
all of these things. But he's a smart politician in the sense that he knows where the Achilles heel is and he knows how to poke at it.
Yeah.
To like rattle the brain of somebody who doesn't have the benefit of the exposure of somebody Mexican or Arab or other in their life to understand that humanity is pretty similar across the board.
Yeah. So let's talk about this new passion project, Arabs in Media, because I do want to get to why you started it, the focus on it, but also this experience, because when we were talking over the phone, I was very curious to know your experience as an Arab American in this country during 9/11.
Yeah.
Obviously, 2 different generations here. I grew up as a child seeing people fall and having a fear of Arabic culture or anybody who was, I'm going to say the word Middle Eastern.
Yeah. That's
because I was like, I don't know. I'm like Irani, Arabic, but I did grow up fear of planes after 9/11. I was 10 years old when that occurred. But your experience is a lot different. And I feel like there's so many similarities of it going on right now where from September 10th to September 11th, the world viewed you different.
Yeah. And it wasn't anything that I hadn't experienced already. So part of it was like Groundhog Day for me, like, oh, here we go again. And I'll give you an example of that. When the federal building in Oklahoma City was bombed, the initial news reports that came out, and the videos are on YouTube, and the historical books have these comments that all of the news players were starting their reports by saying, we have reports that Middle Eastern looking men left the scene. And it was a white nationalist Timothy McVeigh, who had committed the crime, but that was the default setting for many people's brains.
And you hear it from one outlet, and the next outlet gets it. And
even if they make a correction, the damage is done when you make a big mistake, first of all, but also you're filling the cubby hole with information that fits right in because people already have a bias in terms of thinking, oh, well, there's an explosion. It must have been Arab, and they hate our way of life, or they are violent people by nature, or they kill children by nature. And all of these things kind of like rolled off my back after a while, because at some point you just can't focus on that, and you have to live. When 9/11 came along, I was working in Spanish radio, and I was in El Paso, Texas. And that morning, I was going to fly out, and it was supposed to be the Latin Grammys in LA that day, and which was canceled, obviously. But that morning, I went to breakfast with a colleague in the hotel restaurant. When I came back up to my room, the phone rang in my room, and my colleague said, "You need to turn on the TV. Something's going on." So it was like the rest of us who were around then and saw the second plane going live, and were horrified by what was going on and couldn't wrap our brains around what was happening. I just, like, for the rest of the day, without even showering or changing or anything, was just watching, calling, and trying to develop how we were going to respond on radio stations that had never been accustomed to doing anything like breaking news, or, how are you going to inform people what's happening? And so between that and the personal, then I, would get calls from colleagues who knew that I was on the road. I was traveling, living in California. I was in El Paso. And I remembered a conversation I had with one of my bosses at the time. And whatever he said, I said something like, well, I appreciate that, but unfortunately, my experience has been that people are going to immediately go after Middle Eastern guys. And of course, it was that group of Saudi terrorists who had committed this. It could go off on a whole other tangent about what happened from there, because we didn't do anything with Saudi Arabia. Obviously, the country of my origin, Iraq, was soon attacked afterwards, and hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed under the lie of weapons of mass destruction, which were never found and were a total lie to begin with. But put that aside.
We're seeing very similar things nowadays without going into it, just because you're explaining this, and I'm obviously can imagine how the conflict, the internal conflict more than anything, because you've already, like you said, it's Groundhog Day. You already know who they're going to blame and how they're just going to generalize, and and by they, I mean media outlets. Sometimes they haven't done their due diligence and said exactly who it is, and they'd rather, generalize and then kind of start digging in. And maybe correcting, like you said, but at that point, there's no turning back from what society already deems as evil.
And once the story started to unravel and people were beginning to find out who the hijackers were, I'm equally horrified by this as an American. I remember saying something to my dad on the phone at the time, and it was something like, "These guys effed up the world." And he was like, "Yep." And so outside of the things that were happening as the news came out, I was stuck in El Paso for a couple of days because all the airports were shut down. And the news was just going crazy. I mean, aside from the fact that your brain is turning into mush because you can't wrap your head around these images that keep happening over and over and over again. I remember seeing some of the reports, like there were gas station owners in Phoenix who were Sikhs. Sikhs wear a turban. Sikhs are not Muslims. Sikhs weren't the
Yeah.
hijackers or the terrorists of 9/11, but they were being sniped and killed.
Oh my gosh.
And I was like, this was like the ugliest side of
Humanity.
what I saw happening playing out by humanity, because, the U.S. has many times in history taken it out on first person they see type of approach. And so these Sikhs, because they were wearing turbans and the oversimplified mindset that if you're brown and you're wearing a turban, you must be a terrorist, let's kill them. I was like horrified by that. And to make it a little bit more complicated, Phoenix was one of the first and only airports that was opening up, and it was one of my only routes to get back to get back home. There were tons of stories of people who were also in the same boat that were driving across the country, and their flights had been canceled and they were miles away, states away, hours and hours or days away from being able to drive anywhere. And the reservation systems online to try to book a ticket to find an airport that was really open. Finally, I found a flight from Phoenix to California and had heard on the news that the Phoenix airport was reopening, and I didn't get a confirmation when I booked it online because I could barely get through at that time. It was still dial-up.
Yeah.
And the hotel was calling my room because they were like, are you staying for another day? Are you extending your stay? And I just said, you know what? I'm just going to go for this. We'll see where this takes me. I said, no, I don't need the room for another day. I still had my rental car. The rental car companies were waiving their drop-off fees. So I packed up and I got on the road. And I realized that I had like 2 lines of battery on my phone at the time. And I didn't bring a car charger because I didn't think I was going to need one. I was just going to be able to plug in walls. And so I was like, I'm going to have to turn my phone off to save battery for this drive, which was about 8 to 10 hours, I think. And, and former coworkers or current coworkers were calling me up and they're like, hey, stay there. We'll come pick you up in the station van. And they're like, hey, and if anything happens, speak Spanish.
Yeah.
Like if you get into a situation, speak Spanish. And
I was going to ask that, like, obviously, did Spanish help you, or the hotel manager?
Spanish saved my life.
No, but like
in that case,
yeah,
it totally saved my life because I
Okay.
stopped for gas in this little town in New Mexico, Lordsburg, New Mexico, because I'll never forget this. I pulled over because I needed gas, and I saw that there was some fast food there, and I was going to get some food for the road and just continue my drive. And I pulled into the gas station, and this is how small a town it was. They didn't even have a credit card slot for gas. You didn't have to prepay. You could fill up your car and then go in and pay for your gas. That's how small the town was. So I filled up, and then I walked into the mini mart. And I look immediately as I walk in, and there's a guy in full military fatigues, completely decked out with weapons, talking to the cashier through the window. And it was just a thing that went off in my head that just said, just get out of there. Just pay for your gas and get out. So I walked to the back, and I'm looking through the fridge, because I wanted to get some Red Bull for the road. And then I saw a restroom. So I'm like, I better use the restroom before I hit the road because I'm not stopping again. And when I came out of the restroom, the paramilitary guy was blocking me. He had moved to meet me coming out of the restroom. And he said something to me. And I kept walking to the cashier, and I heard him say something again, and I turned around. I said, what was that? He said, how's it going? I said, oh, you're talking to me. He goes, yeah, I'm talking to you. I said, I'm doing all right. How are you? He goes, fine. And I went up to the cashier, and I was like, oh, I'm not using my credit card because of my
your name.
Arab name. So thankfully, I had cash for the gas, and I paid, and I left, and they're watching me on the way out, and stupidly, I'm like, on my original path to go to the fast food place next door. And I was like, why didn't I just get out of there? Because now I was trapped between cars in the drive-thru. And I'm looking at the mini mart from the drive-thru at the fast food next door. And I'm like starting to feel like these chest pains. Like that could have changed. That could have been a completely different outcome. And it wouldn't have taken more than a second in somebody's decision, the way they did the way they sniped the Sikhs, Phoenix, to just take me out. They still could. They could come running out of this mini mart and they could come at me. Like, it was a real feeling. And thankfully, I got my food and hit the road. And I said, I don't care if I shit my pants or wet myself. I'm not stopping until I get to the airport.
But then did you use Spanish during that conversation?
I didn't, but I had it in the back of my mind. Like, had it. And I was wearing a guayabera. So, like, on top of that, I'm like, somebody in here is going to have a cooler mind to say, no, he's not.
Yeah.
But you know what? Nobody should be in a position there where they have to
feel unsafe. Now, getting to the airport, to Phoenix Airport, obviously you have to present documentation, and your name is clearly of Iraqi descent.
Yeah.
Was there any fear from the flight attendants? Was there
No, I mean,
resistance?
that's the weird thing. It's like, you know, I open my mouth and an American starts speaking, right? Proud of my Iraqi heritage, but I mean, these are part of the stereotypes of, you know, society where it's like, oh, Arab surname, you must have an accent, you must do this. And believe me, without any judgment on accents are beautiful.
I think so too.
I sometimes wish.
I wish I had a Colombian accent.
Those are the nice ones, right? All of them are. Yeah. But like, I began to understand the distinguishing Colombian and
Venezuelan
and Argentinians and all of the, even within Mexico, like a Chilango versus Norteño. And like, I've somehow been able to pick up on these things, and I'm really proud of myself for that. But yeah, I mean, I was ready. Yeah. I was at the ready to make a fake phone call in Spanish, to do what I needed to do, because what I felt on the right side of my brain was, this is a threat. This is a clear and present danger. And act normal, because you are there for gas and a Red Bull and to use the bathroom. You're not doing anything wrong. And unfortunately, there are people in the world who can't live in situations where that's, you know, not clear and present for them every day of their lives.
Now, working in the media, did you feel a sense of responsibility to inform or to tell your talent, hey, inform this, or let's be neutral? Or what was the initiative from top to bottom? Yeah.
I mean, I would have to say, you know, we kept it honest. It was, and it's hard to remember exactly what the audience reaction was at the time. We, you know, I mean, one of the things that's really unique about, I think, Spanish language media, stuff that you and I, you know, kind of worked under certain values, was that your job, whether it's your company tagline or not, your job in Spanish language media, particularly in the U.S., has been to inform, entertain, and empower. And so I think we kept true to those values at the time. You know, as an American, I was, you know, so heartbroken by the stories of the people who lost their lives, who died, who were killed by these attacks. And that's always been my thought in life. And I think we kept it honest to that approach. I personally, the world has evolved and changed since then as well. I think it would have been only too easy to make it about, you know, an ethnicity versus a real problem to solve, right, at the time. And frankly, you know, the part of me that just couldn't believe where we were was, because I'd lived through the first Iraq war, working in radio as well. And here we were after 9/11, which had nothing to do with Iraq, and just sitting down with my, bowl of chips to watch the State of the Union with
Bush.
And then he goes into the axis of evil thing. And I was like, what? What is he talking about? Axis of what?
Mm-hmm.
And then he mentions Korea and Iraq. And I was like, no, like right in my living room. I was like, no, because I knew in my bones exactly what was up.
Was Bush Sr. during the Iraq War?
Bush Sr. was the first Iraq War. Yeah.
So makes sense. Checks out. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I was just like, I know it's coming. And I remember talking to a lot of friends back then. They were like, oh, you don't think we're going to war, do you? And I'm like, oh, hell yes, we are. I mean, these things are not mistakes when people mention something like that. And of course, we've learned so much since then through film, through documentary, through history, through the media, kind of apologizing that they, we took the yellow cake uranium story or enriched plutonium or whatever it was, and we ran with it without questioning it.
Yeah.
These are just total failures on media's part.
Yeah.
To go with a government narrative without really investigating, which is what our press used to do here. It's one of the most interesting and challenging areas of civic life that you could count on in American media. Is that they would challenge narratives to get at the real story, but now I think they just don't question things because it preserves access.
Yeah, and then I think we also entered a digital age where what was I gonna say? Where the internet was coming afloat. So I remember clearly that that 9/11 really affected me as a civilian, just being afraid of planes, but also knowing that I can travel to Mexico and not necessarily be like, okay, I don't think anything's going to happen on this side of the world. The first time that I traveled to Europe, though, I remember, and we spoke about this over the phone, when I was coming back from Rome, I saw a woman in her
the hijab,
but like
abaya,
everything. And our first stop was Detroit, Michigan. I was totally unaware that Detroit, Michigan had a huge Muslim population. But before we got on the plane, I just saw her praying on the floor, et cetera, et cetera. And my mind immediately went to 9/11 because I just knew that a plane from this side of the ocean was coming to the United States. And I just so happened to be, and I have no control over it. Call it the universe, call it God or whatnot, but I was terrified and went into the plane. I was one of the first ones to board, and I was just praying and whatnot. And I was just like, okay, where is she going to be so I can keep an eye on what this person is going to be? Because that's how I feel media has put fear in society's eyes. And lo and behold, she sat next to me. That was her assigned seat. We had the best conversation ever. And I remember telling my friends, telling my parents, the whole process of how ignorant I was to this situation, So that was definitely life-changing, I would say.
That's a beautiful story. And it's another reminder of how much we have in common with each other versus different from each other. And it reminds me actually of my father, who was on a trip to Iraq. I want to say, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 years ago. And his seatmate was an Orthodox Jewish man. And they talked the entire flight from Chicago, New York, where my father was changing planes. And he had a long layover. And during that layover, my dad's always been a little bit of an explorer and curious and wants to check things out. And so he exited the terminal to, do some kicking around New York City, and he ran into his seatmate. And his seatmate said, "What are you doing? I thought you had a flight." He's like, "Yeah, I've got a few hours to catch my next flight." He goes, "I'm actually really hungry for a New York Jewish pastrami on rye."
Wow.
And the guy said to him, "Well, let's share a cab. I'll tell you, let's go to Brooklyn. We'll go together." So they ended up at this Jewish deli in Brooklyn, and the guy's whole family came over to meet this seatmate from Chicago, my dad. And, that was that.
Yeah.
It's like, that's how simple life can be.
Yeah.
Really, at its best.
Unfortunately, we are living very similar situations in terms of like the perception of people, of cultures in media in today's age. And obviously, for those who are probably like, what are you talking about? I'm talking about the whole issue with Palestine and Israel. How unfortunately, like, because a group of bad people did something, it started this huge war between, well, I wouldn't say war. I would personally, my words, don't take it into context, I would call it a genocide, right? What is happening in Palestine and in Gaza just because of a certain population, which now people are people feel like are waking up and seeing what is really going on thanks to social media, something that we didn't have back in 9/11. And now you're starting this company, I would say, Arabs in media, to basically spread real mess. I don't want to say that media doesn't, but I feel like you said they withhold some information that is probably very complicated to explain, but would rather just say the surface level instead of going into contextual stuff, which is what you do in Arabs in media now.
I think we're in a real interesting time. I think we're experiencing a lot of change. And how do I put this? I think we're in dark times with certain parts of this, because there's a certain level of McCarthyism that's happening for people who are expressing questions or points of view on the humanity of this all at its core, and who get canceled. It so much so that I'm even going to be starting a segment in my podcast as part of Arabs in Media as cancellations of the week. Like literally, it is so frequent. And it's not just people in media or people in socials. It's people losing jobs, employment, livelihoods for lots of different approaches to this.
Maria, oh my gosh, I forgot her name from Scream.
Melissa Barrera.
Melissa Barrera. She just posted pro-Palestinian awareness of what was going on, and she was immediately fired for it. Then Jenna Ortega decided, I'm going to step out of this project, and I think it hurt the project more. And that's where I'm sometimes confused as to like, where do your First Amendment rights of freedom of speech come into play? Yeah. Like, they're only allowed for a certain group of people, but not for another group of people.
Yeah. I did a whole episode in Substack on the college protests and why people were losing their minds over it. And, what was really difficult about seeing all of the college protests play out at the different university campuses was you would see a completely different story on social media from the ground versus the official report coming from cable news or the official stories or newspaper coverage of it online. And, for somebody who's curious like me and also who obsesses over this, not only out of personal interest, but because now it's my work to identify where the media has done its job and where it's failed us when it comes not just to portraying Arabs, but to covering real news events in a way that does it justice for people to understand really what's happening. And I was getting so many different mixed signals of what was happening. And, I think humans default to wanting to see a headline and take away the whole story there because we're busy and we can't manage too many pieces of information at one time. Yeah. And we just look for the simple black and white truth, and we miss nuance or we miss details, or if we're being given a headline that misses that, either deliberately or not, leaves out a really important part of the story, then we're missing sometimes the entire essence of it. We lose context and perspective. Yeah. And one of my challenges has been that after October 7th, aside from my personal shock and looking at this, I had an oh shit, this is going to get bad, because the history of Gaza has been every 3, 4, 5 years, it gets not obliterated like it is now, but I think Norman Finkelstein, a Jewish scholar and studier of the entire region for decades, said that it was a foreign policy from Israel to mow the lawn every few years, which is a shocking term that, as a human, first and foremost, I'm like, that can't be right. But, he has all the receipts, he will talk about it for hours and hours and hours. So not for me to paraphrase him, but to say that I knew, stuff was going to come down, but I had no idea that it would be to this extent. And I think what's different now in the social media coverage of it is now we're seeing it live on our phones. It's not that we wouldn't see images before, but now people are calling out how the loss of life is languaged on one side versus another. One side is getting massacred and killed. The other one died, as if it was like some spontaneous, like they just dropped while they were walking down the sidewalk. There's lots of mischaracterization.
Yeah, and it's sort of like the way access to the information is getting out. Thanks to social media, we see, two different sides of the story. I'm recalling the Flower Massacre, which I don't think it was enough coverage here in the United States. I listened to morning radio on my way to work, and obviously it's talk radio and it's news radio, and they in the beginning, I remember it was a lack of even mentioning anything Palestinian, and I never understood why, and I only had social media to kind of inform me, and it was through horrific images. When the Flower Massacre occurred, I was just like, oh my God. So for those who are listening or viewing, the Flower Massacre was something that happened in Gaza, where they finally allowed from, I believe, Egypt, or they just allowed food into Gaza territory, and they were going to take on flour just because it's very much of the culture to have like something similar to like tortillas, right? They're made out of flour.
It's your daily bread.
Yeah, it's their daily bread. So they stacked up all this flour for the people to come and get so they can go and feed their families. As they were approaching to grab the flour, what was the narrative of the story and how it was said is the people who were dropping off the flour, which were from Israel, felt like that they were going to get attacked. Keep in mind, these are people who have weapons versus the people from Gaza who had none. What they had was they were hungry. They had hunger. That's what they had. As they were approaching to grab the flour, they were shot and killed. And a lot of these bags of flour were covered in blood once they were actually recuperated and distributed, hence calling it the Flower Massacre. Yeah. And
there are many more massacres that have happened before and since then. And we become numb to it, which scares me.
It's sort of like school shootings. Or massacres. It's unfortunate that when I hear of one, I get saddened, but I'm not surprised. And it's horrific. My question to you is, why do you think a lot of media outlets have a policy or have imposed a policy of not to talk about this topic?
That's the $1 million question, Jose.
Yeah,
it really is. Because as I do my work trying to facilitate conversations similar to this, I find so many examples of things that don't get reported or they get misreported. And, my first response is, just do better. Come on. But there was an example. And maybe there's a theory that we can come up with here, or maybe you have an idea, because I'm interested, frankly, in what your impression would be. But I take away a really clear one. And when the Columbia University protests were going on, they took over a dormitory called Hamilton Hall. Whether it was a dorm or not, it was called Hamilton Hall. And the students released a banner outside of it, and they called it Hind's Hall.
Mm.
Hind was a 6-year-old girl in Gaza who was trying to escape the violence with her family in a car. She was in the car with a cousin and a few other family members when the car came under attack from Israeli gunfire, whether it was tank or shells or what weapon, I can't remember. And there are recordings of her calling the Red Crescent Society, which is like the Red Cross.
Mm-hmm.
And the 6-year-old girl was telling the female operator that she was scared and alone, and will you please come get me? I'm around my family. They've all been killed. And they kept her on the phone for hours while they were saying they were trying to get her help. And they went through this complex structure of having an intermediary coordinate a Red Crescent ambulance, go retrieve her at her coordinates with coordination of the Israeli military. So they weren't directly communicating, but they were coordinating through a third party for humanitarian reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So they finally get 2 Red Crescent Palestinian workers in an ambulance to go retrieve this girl. And the phone call at some point was cut off. They heard nothing more from her. They heard nothing more from the ambulance drivers. And 2 weeks later, they found all of the bodies killed and decomposing.
No.
So the Israeli military not only killed the girl who had been the last survivor in this car with her family, but they killed the people that they knew were coordinated to go out there and rescue this little girl.
Now, I'm hearing the story, and I'm going to play devil's advocate just because I feel there's so much of that going on where people are literally explaining their side of the story, their experiences literally in Gaza or in other areas. But then there comes, oh no, that's fake news. We like, that's not true. That's not what really happened. She died in the explosion, or their family was doing this. And I feel like, where is this? There's a loss of humanity. There's a child.
It's a total loss of humanity. This is the stuff that makes me cry.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I can't bring myself to write or record this content because it's so depressing and heartbreaking. And the ultimate reality of that story was, and this is where we can change how we talk about this, and we can do better. There was a panel on CNN at the time, and the anchor reporter with a panel of people talked about the breaking news at Columbia and the banner that had been unfurled from the window that said Hind's Hall. And she says, Hind, of course, is a woman who died in Gaza.
That's it.
Punto final.
Not a woman, it's a child.
It was a child. And this child was widely reported on. Even the press outlets who tend to have bias in their coverage and reporting, they reported on Hind because it had captured the imagination of the world. And it was a human interest story. And they all reported on her death. They all reported on her death. Found dead in car. Now, whether or not, all evidence, including GPS coordinates, all of the research that's been done on that, it was a military operation from Israel that killed her and the rescue workers who had been coordinated with them. The fact that an anchor would come out and say, that like in an effort to characterize the Columbia students as having no
There's no
center.
Reason. Yeah.
Like they're just a bunch of rabble rousers.
They're college kids.
They're college kids. They just want to create a scene, such drama. You know, that's just a woman who died in Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
And it just infuriated me because, you know, that impression was meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
That left an impression with however many people were watching and who have seen that clip play over. That's all it was.
Yeah. Do you think you asked me earlier, like the $1 million question, why don't they report on it? I don't want to say that like, oh, this is what's going on. But from my conversations with a lot of my friends, and we grew up with social media, we grew up with 9/11, but then we also grew up in a society where information, we had a lot more access to it. And I think because we've gone to college, we've seen the diversity that there is out in the world. And we can come to terms of like, okay, well, let's research beyond the story. We've always said, and we don't quote us that it's true or not, but is there higher politicians, higher businessmen who are of a particular origin who are basically saying, do not report on it or you'll lose funding? And obviously this country is built by so many immigrants, businessmen, but they can also control the agenda.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, the most cynical way to look at this is to understand that media is a business. And so corporate media is dependent on a couple of different things. One is if they have news, for example, to like kind of navigate this shift that I told you has, I believe has happened since journalism has evolved over the decades from kind of questioning the authority of the government to kind of just repeating the government approach without really having a challenge or conversation about it. And by that I mean there's a term called access journalism, right? At the end of the day, you know, the main networks also need to have access to the administration for the interviews that to them are important to drive the conversation and the narrative. Not everybody does, but I think a lot of people do. They have played that game, right? And then the other part of it is media is in a crisis right now. Traditional media is in a crisis. It's shrinking. People are cutting the cord faster than, faster than you can count.
Yeah. I don't have cable.
And I am too, right?
Yeah.
Getting to the heart of a story now, you can just find a clip. You don't have to watch something live.
That's true.
To really take something in.
That's true. I mean, it happens with radio, and it's sort of like, oh, wow, look at this artist that they said this, and we play the clip, but it's like, okay, but what did that person say before? And what did that person say after? Then it's like, okay, that's the true context. And that's where the journalism is I think it's failing, It's sort of like, okay, you got a clip, but what's the context of the clip? Because if you want to cause controversy, then any clip can do that for you.
Yeah.
Podcast clips do that. And they get people in trouble, but it's always like, watch the entire context of it and then understand that.
Yeah. I agree with that. And, thankfully, I think there are a lot of platforms now that are doing that. They'll take a clip that went viral and then they'll say, we're going to put this into context. Here's a little bit before, here's a little bit after, and then that person was fired. So when you look at the narrow clip, you understand that it looks really bad, and the company is trying to be justified in their firing of a talent because of X, Y, or Z. And then when you zoom out and you see everything that happened from start to finish, you're like, okay, maybe they were just looking for an excuse.
From your perspective, has traditional media, so mainstream media, failed the Arabic community?
Oh wow, that's a great question. I feel like we don't get proper representation. And it's not just in news coverage. I think there are problems that go back decades in Hollywood everything from representation. If you're an actor, and there are people who have told me that they came to Hollywood just 'cause they want to be an actor, like that.
Yeah.
I just want to be on the screen. That's their
Yeah.
dream. They want to act. They want to be an actor, and they get out there, and the auditioning process I couldn't tell you about, but I'm sure it's cruel and it's hard and it's a grind.
Mm-hmm.
But the only roles that they would be getting offered would be the terrorist.
Yeah.
And some did it because they had to eat, and some couldn't live with that anymore, with the conscious of that. And they said, no, I'm not. I know it's acting, but this is like playing into this narrative that's all we are.
Now I ask another question, very similar. Has Spanish media failed the Arabic community?
That is interesting, because I've only spot checked since I left Spanish language media to see how they're tackling these items. And in some ways, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, you and I both worked for a company that was actually really at the forefront of educating its own employee population on the ideas of equitable treatment of different employee bases internally. And they made high profile suspensions during different things that had happened. For example, I think one network had covered the World Cup, and some of their reporters and this was when it was in South Africa, and they made some sort of a parody song or something like that, dancing or chanting African sounding, stereotypically African sounding things, but it was clearly mocking Africans. And it was probably out of ignorance, for the people who had done it, who thought, what? It's just, having fun. But it had real repercussions. And maybe those repercussions were also their presence being able to cover it in South Africa. But they pulled those folks right away. So we've seen that kind of thing. They were at the forefront of progressive policies internally. I just don't know, frankly, how much Spanish language media is covering Gaza. I've seen comments.
Should they?
In social. Yes, I think so. I think it's a humanitarian issue. I think Gaza is all of us. I think, I hesitated jumping into this conversation about Gaza initially because I thought, well, I can't speak to the history the way a Palestinian can. I can't speak to, the pain personally or otherwise of somebody who has been displaced violently or otherwise, or who has lost their home or is a refugee or has had family members that have been killed in this conflict. And I do know people who have had their homes completely destroyed, and this person survived, that person didn't, and this person got out to Egypt, the rest of them can't because it costs that much money and this and that. My impression is we're not seeing that. We're not seeing that humanitarian issue. And who are we if we're not humans first?
Now, speaking on the humanity and Middle Eastern cultures, Arabics, people from Gaza who are living in the United States, who are probably working in media, there's a fear of speaking out. There's a fear. What would you tell those people like yourself who were once in a position in the entertainment industry, who go home and are mad at the lack of representation, the lack of, humanity in the media, yet they're also staying silent? Because it is a true fear, like speaking out and speaking of, it's like, this can change my life and I get fired.
I have a few thoughts on this. One is, I think what's most important more than anything else is what's in your heart. Because we find ourselves in complicated spaces in terms of the ability to say something. And there is a whole segment of social media activists who find it very comfortable to shame other people for not speaking out. And some of that I can understand, some of it I can't. But, and clearly there are going to be some of these points that they try to make by saying, hey, this person is a major celebrity and they have 100 million Instagram followers. They could just say one little thing and imagine the change that would happen.
Like if a Taylor Swift said free Palestine,
right?
Like what can that do? You know?
And I think a celebrity like that is very measured. They're like, the fact that she hasn't said anything is not a mistake. It's not like she doesn't know about it. That people have, the Swifties who are, you know, following this news are critical of her. There's a whole segment of Swifties. I forgot if they have a hashtag or name, but they're trying to, you know, kind of force her hand. And same thing with some Beyonce fans. Because they're probably the biggest two female artists who could make a huge difference.
Because, I was going to say one's a mother, one's a woman. And we see so many women and children are probably the most killed during this genocide. Yeah. You know?
That's the thing that gets me the most. You know, there was a story I was researching and I found a social media video of a guy in Gaza who went to the beach as the aid was being dropped by the parachutes, which was that's a whole nother topic to, like, we'll just open up the gates, drive them in. You won't have to drop it on people and kill some of them that way. There are people like the Flower Massacre who are rushing to try to get something coming down in a parachute. And he starts interviewing little kids. And he would ask him, "How are you?" And this little 7-year-old boy is saying, "I want to die."
Oh my God.
And he wasn't the only one. He wasn't the exception. There is a rising incidence of suicidal ideation from children, little kids. And you know what? There's a part of me that gets so furious because I know that if this was any other country in the world, stop the presses. Every day, all day, front page, feature story, lead story. This stuff doesn't get covered unless you're watching social media.
Yeah.
And I think that's the shift that's happening, that's freaking out mainstream media. And this is where I have a little bit of hope, because ultimately media is also a business. And as public opinion has been changing, especially with people under 30, who are the future voters, the ones who make elections, you know, live or die.
Yeah.
So are some of the changes that happen, because ultimately that represents a voter block and a market.
Yeah.
And you just, you know, mainstream mass appeal media, by definition, has to give people what they want ultimately once they know it. And they can't unsee some of the stuff they've seen now.
Yeah. There's, you know, you're seeing death on social media. You're seeing bodies on social media, things that you shouldn't be seeing at a young age. And yeah. And with that being said, Arabs in Media is your new venture. It's also a podcast. It's also a blog post. Yeah. What are your hopes with it?
You know, my hopes are to laugh again. And when I first, so I'll tell you that, like, I don't want to call it an inspiration, because that sounds like, you know, like, oh, you know, like the sunset and I felt
motive.
warm. And, yeah, my motive. After I started to see some of the genocidal comments coming from the Israeli government about Palestinians, calling them, you know, less than human, subhuman. Aside from that, seeing how some of the reaction on the street was being covered in Israel and here, I was like, okay, we have a humanity problem. We have a humanization problem. And like, duh, but also I wanted to do something about it. I wanted to take a look at how Arabs are featured in news and entertainment and now social media. And I thought, okay, well, my original dream was like, we need to kind of have something that's like The Daily Show, because Arab humor is really sarcastic. We can be really funny sarcastically. Not everybody, obviously, we're not monolithically that way. Otherwise, the whole world wouldn't, stop laughing long enough to bomb us some more. But yeah, I think ultimately featuring not just more Arab creators, but opening a window to the culture that people might not have a window to.
Yeah, like this tea, for example.
Yes.
I had no idea. Like, I was like, oh my God, this is traditional?
Yeah. So in Arabic, we call tea chai, but if you go to a coffee chain where they serve tea, a lot of times chai is the Indian type of chai, which is mixed with a lot of spices and milk, and it's a different concoction. Chai is just the Arabic word, at least from Iraq, for tea. And we drink tea all day.
Really?
Like,
I had no idea.
All day. Like if you go to Miami and you have a cafecito, like they bring you the Cuban coffee in little shot cups.
Yeah.
This is our cafecito. Like these little cups all day, every day. You can, and I think when you're there, you can drink
good
it.
portion.
You could drink this before bed and still go to sleep. And only when you're there, I think, or if you're in an Arab household.
Which I am today.
Yes, you are. Yeah.
Yeah. So obviously highlighting creators, highlighting
The stories,
giving it more dimensions than what it's traditionally and historically been represented as. And then with your podcast, obviously blog posts, but then transitioning to having these conversations with other creators or other people of Arabic descent or Middle Eastern descent. Because I honestly, like my ignorance, I don't know that many countries or who would, fall into the categories.
Yeah.
And that is my own ignorance, and I admit it.
You know what? I mean, the important thing is just being open to learning it.
Yeah.
Just like I had to be too, because I was, part of my fear was, do I even know enough? Because, I grew up here. And yet I find that certainly when we are, having food or chai or family conversations or music, those are the things that really unite us and maybe weave a common thread between cultures. There's so many influences between the cultures. And todos somos primos, I mean, I think the goal is, certainly to create awareness, but also to inform people. And, if I'm going to borrow anything from, the years that I was lucky enough to work in Spanish language media, it was like that trifecta of empower, inform, and entertain. And I know just as a person who worked on the inside of media that if I get too far down the road of lecturing people, they're going to tune out. They don't want to hear it. But there were a couple of episodes or moments leading up to, an episode where I was like, I can't say anything. There's nothing funny about a genocide, and so how do I do this? How do I say this in a way that reaches people and reaches more people? Because, if I'm just talking to my family, I might as well just stop the podcast and just talk to them about these things. But I want the message and the imagery of Arab creators, whether it's audio or video or both, to get out there and for the word to be spread. I see people that I'm constantly humbled by and their ability to articulate a humanistic point of view and walk you through a story that's happening in Gaza or anywhere in the Arab world, talking about their personal experience with this.
Yeah.
And these are stories that, we have the ability to tell. These are stories that we have the ability to share with others. And I'm a particular personal fan of comedy.
Yeah.
I went to 3 different comedy shows over the past few months. It took a lot for me to make the decision to give myself permission to be in an environment where there are jokes coming from comics who are of Arab descent. And when I went there, I was so relieved because we also need to be able to take care of our own souls and spirits to be able to do what we do to help others.
Yeah.
And they weren't anything other than a great experience that gave me permission to laugh a little, but also be in the space of sharing my point of view, my perspective, and if it's a cynical, humorous way or sarcastic way of communicating something, then so be it.
Yeah. Where can people find you if they
So-
want to learn more?
The @ is Arabs in Media, and that's on Substack, where you'll find the written posts that go along with the podcast. And whenever I release a new podcast as well, I will insert a link for the podcast itself. But if you sign up at Arabs in Media on Substack, it's a free subscription. You'll get an email alert every time I drop a new episode. Or you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, every podcast iHeart. All of them are carrying Arabs in Media as a podcast. I picked something that you can't misspell.
Yeah. And then also on social media.
And it's also on social media. Right now, Instagram is where I'm focusing the time and attention. And Substack, which is social. And it's a really interesting platform that I'm learning more about as well because it's got social components to it that I'm just starting to learn. And I think a lot of great writers are on that platform as well.
Haz, I'd like to thank you for your time. Thank you for your storytelling. And thank you for enlightening people here in Echale Podcast on your experiences growing up as a Arab here in the United States.
Gracias por invitarme a tu podcast Echale. Es buenísimo el contenido. Thank you for having me. It's great to reconnect here. And I appreciate you shining a light on this and being curious and open to our shared interest in humanity.
All right. With that being said, free Palestine.
Free Palestine.